Hello and welcome to this video for Comp 3218, Game Design and Development at the University of Southampton. My name's Dave Millard, I'm one of the lecturers on the course, and in this video we're going to be talking about systematic storytelling. Essentially, how do we deal with interactive narratives within our games? The video is split into two parts, so firstly we'll be looking at interactive narratives themselves, what their definition is, emergent versus designed stories, and how they are realised within a game system. And then we're going to be talking about agency, about how we give choices to our players, how we make sure those are real choices and not just calculations, and how we manage agency and deal with something called the narrative paradox. So let's start off by talking about interactive narrative and think about what that is. So the OED defines narrative as a spoken or written account of connected events, a story, and it defines a story as an account of imaginary or real people and events told for entertainment. But how do we realise that within a game? Well, Tracy Fullerton, in her book, she talks about the elements of drama, how we can find the parts of a game which are related to a story. So, for example, she talks about the premise. This is sort of the part that establishes the setting, gives some kind of metaphor, gives you some sort of investment in what's going on. So, for example, in Space Invaders, you're on a planet, you're being attacked by aliens, and you're an anonymous protagonist responsible for defending the planet. Whereas in Diablo, you're a wandering warrior who arrives in Tristram, and the townspeople ask you for help. So the premise is a kind of a story that sets you up, if you like, and gives you a motivation for engaging with the game and explains the goals that you have as a player. Then within the game itself, we may want to build up characters. And again, by identifying with characters, we make them more than just their pixel representations. The audience starts to internalize events that are happening. It creates empathy, it creates engagement. We're also using narrative for world building, so to create a sense of a larger world beyond the game itself. And that's something that can keep players interested and engaged. And Fullerton also talks about the dramatic arc, which is essentially the conflict at the heart of the drama, which draws people in emotionally, creates a sense of tension. And she makes the point that dramatic tension is as important to the success of a game as it is to a really good film or a novel. Perhaps one way of thinking about this is that narrative is taking the part of the magic circle for games. So the magic circle is the environment which is created in order for us to engage with a piece of entertainment. So it can be conjured by all sorts of things. So in a cinema, the lights going down that's the establishment of the magic circle. In the theatre, the curtains being drawn, the music swelling. These are the things that bring you in to that piece of entertainment and say to you, you're not a person sat in a theatre seat. You are the protagonist of the movie. You are the person in the play. And in the case of a game, it's saying, you're not sat in your lounge holding your PlayStation controller in your hands. You are, you are Zelda. You are Mario. You are the person who is in that game and is engaging with those problems. So narrative is part of that magic circle. It's part of the way in which we create a space in which games become more meaningful, and we sort of suspend our disbelief, or we suspend our knowledge of reality, and we sort of slip into that magic circle to engage with the game. But that's what narrative does, and that's why it's useful for games. But what actually is it? If we were to break it down and look at its constituent parts, what do we have? Well, there's a long history of people studying narratology, and much of it is actually quite accessible to computer science because it takes a very structuralist view. So, for example, you have the Russian formalists, people like Vladimir Prop, for example, who looked at common patterns and structures and archetypes in folklore and fairy tales. You then have the structuralists, people like Todorov or Roland Barthes, and what they were doing was essentially looking for the common structures in our storytelling and trying to understand what those common structures might tell us about ourselves as people. All of this was brought together rather nicely by Mika Ball in her book Narratology from 1985, and that's what I'm going to use as a kind of a framework to explain what's going on here. Is the three layers that Ball uses. So she describes that a narrative is made up of these kind of three parts. So in essence, it is a fabula. So that, if you like, is the stuff that happens. It is the series of events, the people, the things that occur. And if you like, the fabula is a sort of a chronology of things that are relevant for a particular story. The story itself is then the way in which the fabula is organized in a certain way. So it is the structuring, the rearrangement of those elements in order to create some kind of effect. So with some sort of dramatic tension, for example. And then those stories are then realized in some kind of medium. So she calls this the narrative text. So this is the words, if you like, in a novel, or the images that you see on the screen in a movie. So the narrative text is the way in which that story is realized for a particular medium. An example that's quite useful for understanding this, and one that's quite common, is Christopher Nolan's Memento, which is an excellent film that I thoroughly recommend you go and have a look at. Now, Christopher Nolan is a director who loves to play with time, and Memento is no exception. It's the story of a man who's trying to find the person who murdered his wife, but the man has memory loss, which means that they can't remember anything other than the short term. So to get across the effect of this in the film, Nolan tells the story backwards. So in the fabula, what happens is that his wife is murdered, and he then goes on a quest to discover who that murderer is. But in the film, the story is told backwards. And the reason for that is that in every scene, the audience doesn't know what happened in the previous scene, which is exactly the same as the protagonist because of his memory loss. And then we can think of Memento as having a number of different narrative texts. So there's the movie script, for example. That's one type of text that encapsulates the story. But also the movie itself is another example of that particular story. And we can imagine that story being written up as a novel, for example, as well. So how do we apply this to games? Well, if we take Fullerton's elements, we can sort of map them against these things. So the premise, the characters, the world building, these are all part of the fabula. They're the things that happen, the people, the places, those kind of things. The dramatic arc, that is the story. So it's the way in which they are arranged in which to get some particular effect from the player. And the narrative text effectively becomes the game text. And just as different mediums have different rules, so there are rules for how you construct a novel, or rules of thumb perhaps for how you construct a novel. There are rules of cinematography and guidance for how you would do that. So we have the rules of a game, and we can turn to our game design principles in order to try and understand how we should realize a story in the medium of an actual game. So what sort of stories do we have in games then? Well, broadly speaking, there are two types. So the first are emergent stories. So the classic example of this would be The Sims. So in emergent stories, there is no pre-planned structure. So no author has sat down and determined the things that happen. The fabula and the story, they come completely from the player's actions, interacting with the mechanics of the game. So this relies essentially as the player as the storyteller. And there are two principles here. So one is narrative sense making, and that's the way that human beings naturally make sense of what is going on by using stories. So if somebody says to you, what did you do over the weekend? You won't just give them a chronology. You won't just start listing, well, on Saturday morning I woke up and then I went downstairs and I had breakfast. And you will immediately pick out the important salient things, and you will put them together in a way that makes an interesting story. That's narrative sense making. We understand through storytelling. And that's what people do when you present them with a complex emergent narrative. They have a simulation which is happening in the screen in front of them, and they will make sense of that by creating stories in their minds about what is actually occurring. It also relies on our very powerful sense of anthropomorphism, which is where we basically project onto inanimate objects the sorts of feelings and behavior that we expect from people. So anyone who's got annoyed at an object knows what this feeling is. There's a classic Faulty Cars episode where John Cleese gets out of his car and he beats it with a branch because it won't start, and he's anthropomorphizing his car. He's imagining it that it's not an inert object. It's not an engine which has problems, but it is actually a kind of a sentient thing that sort of has it in for him, and therefore deserves to be beaten with a stick. And again, this is what's happening with emergent storytelling. We're anthropomorphizing. We're reading more into the actions of the Sims than are actually there. These systems can be very effective. They require some quite complex and rich mechanics because the simulation has to be really interesting. There shouldn't be too much repetition. There shouldn't be too much randomness, and the simulation has to produce some sort of credible and coherent event. So in other words, these sort of causal chains should be quite important. But if we have a simulation which does that, then people playing will automatically see stories in what they are saying. So because there is no storyteller, or in a sense we're asking the player to be the storyteller, there's no way to guarantee conflict and drama. Although there are lots of ways in which you can try and ensure that happens, for example, by giving people conflicting goals within the simulation. That's a particularly good way of doing it. But it's an open research area as to how, for example, we might use artificial intelligence to ensure that in a kind of a simulation environment, an emergent storytelling situation, good stories evolve. At the other end of the spectrum, we have design stories, and I think this is probably a bit more what people think of when they think of interactive narrative within games. So this would be games like Mass Effect, for example, where there is a planned story structure. The thing is written by narrative designers and authors. But what this does is it limits the player's influence on the fabulous. So the player no longer has the ability to make everything possible happen. They only have a certain amount of flexibility within the confines that the designer has laid down. So here the designer is clearly acting as the storyteller. And there are kind of two ways to approach this. So one would be to use story as journey. So the story becomes a sort of sequence of locations, and you maintain progress by pushing the person through that sequence, either by having it as a series of levels, for example, or by having some kind of open world where there are limitations on travel. So a classic example would be in Monkey Island. At the very beginning, Guybrush Threepwood starts on the deck of a ship, but then he's shot onto the island from a cannon. There's no way for him to get back. So story can happen as a kind of unfolding of locations, but it can also happen as an unfolding of events. So this is the idea of drama. And those events are typically not game dynamics, although they could be. And the player may or may not influence the progress and direction of the story. So they could actually have some kind of agency and choose the direction, or they could be sort of more passive observers, and their agency is in the mechanics of the game in other kind of ways. And these are often combined together, and there are classic examples of this, perhaps most famously the hero's journey, which we will deal with in a separate lecture. So how do you make these systems work? Well, if you think about the way in which a game kind of works at a very simplistic level, this is an idea that comes from Ernest Adams' Fundamentals of Game Design. You can think about the player. They are interacting with a user interface. That user interface essentially generates events from the player that go into the kind of the game engine or the core mechanics. That then creates in-game events, which is communicated back to the player through the user interface. So that's the kind of classic way in which a game is structured and works. This is absolutely sufficient for emergent narratives, as long as you have a good rich set of mechanics, as we were saying. And actually it can kind of work for simple journey stories. So if you have a sequence of locations or levels that progressively tell the story of a player progressing through a game, that can be supported by this kind of classic structure. But as soon as you bring in the idea of drama, where you want kind of narrative events happening, then you need to extend this model to include some kind of storytelling engine. And the storytelling engine generates narrative events which are communicated to the player. So that might be, for example, dialogue interactions, or it might be a kind of cutscenes, or it might be a kind of narration. It could be environmental storytelling, so discovering signs within the game, or books, or text, or anything else that communicates information about the story. But most importantly, the storytelling engine communicates with the game engine, the kind of core mechanics of the game. And those triggers go in both directions. So what that means is that people will do things in the game world. They will interact with the game using the core mechanics of the game, and the storytelling engine will be alerted when they do things that will affect the story. And that could be quite simple. It could be choosing to go through one door rather than another. It could be whether or not they have killed a particular enemy, and that might have an impact on the story. But there should be some way for the mechanics to influence the narrative. But at the same time, the narrative has to go the other way. The narrative has to influence the kind of the game engine and the core mechanics of the game. So, for example, as a result of the state of the narrative, so for example, we've got to a point in the narrative where the player is no longer trusted by a particular character in the game. Well, perhaps that will affect the game engine in that character will no longer support the player when they get into trouble, for example. Or maybe in the narrative at this point, the player has lost a particular item or a particular piece of equipment, and that's manifest in the game world by that particular item being removed from their inventory and no longer being available to them. So the point is that the game world and the narrative state, if you like, the storytelling engine, they are working together and they are both influencing one another. So what about linear versus non-linear structures? Because you could have a kind of digital story which is linear. You progress through the game, the story unfolds, and you find out what happens at the end. And there are some very successful games which kind of have that mold. Perhaps most famously the Uncharted series. So I mean, there are some clear benefits to doing linear storytelling. So first of all, it's a lot cheaper because every time you have non-linearity and the player can make a choice, you have to create more content for your game. Your storytelling engine is a lot simpler. You just have to keep track of where in the story the player is. You don't have to worry about kind of different branches of the story and keeping things coherent. Non-linear stories are very complex. Because of that, you're very unlikely to come across bugs in linear storytelling or inconsistencies in the story, whereas that's very possible with non-linear stories. And of course, as a player, if the story is linear, then if you play the game once, you've experienced everything the game has to offer. Whereas with non-linear stories, you have to play the game many times. So in that case, why do we bother with interactive non-linear narratives at all? What is the point? Well, I would posit that it's because of agency. Because in linear storytelling, your agency is very low. You have very little impact on what happens in the narrative. Whereas in non-linear storytelling, your agency can be quite high. And that's kind of the whole point of a game. I mean, I think the defining characteristic of a game is that you have agency over what happens. It's the one thing that makes games different from all the other types of media we interact and consume. So that means that understanding how we have agency within interactive narrative is really important because it's sort of the whole point. So what is agency? Well, the OED defines agency as the ability to act or exert power. Wikipedia defines it as our capacity to act in any given environment. So it's our ability to make choices effectively. Games are not the only medium to have agency. Arseth, in his book Cybertext, he came up with a definition of ergodic literature. This is any type of literature where non-trivial effort is required to allow the reader to traverse the text. It comes from the Greek words ergon, work, and hodos for path. So essentially, text that you have to work at to progress. And there are other examples that are non-digital. So, for example, the I Ching, the Chinese Book of Changes, is a divination text. You select yarrow sticks, there's a modern method with coin tosses, and the result of that is you identify a particular pattern, a hexagram, or a transformation between hexagrams. Each one of those is a chapter in the I Ching. So what happens is you come along, you ask a question, you draw your yarrow sticks, and a result of that you read two particular one or two chapters of the I Ching and use that chapter to interpret what will happen. So in that case, it's very similar to the sort of the notion of tarot cards, for example. these examples exist in performance art. So in Ayn Rand's The Night of January 16th, this is a play which is a courtroom murder trial, but at the beginning of the play, members of the audience are selected to play the jury, and they actually pass a verdict at the end, and their decision changes the end of the play. So the play changes potentially every night, depending on what the jury believe. And of course, there's some early examples of digital literature in the hypertext world. So Michael Joyce's Afternoon, a Story is from 1987. It's a hypertext novel published by Eastgate Systems. It kind of has a traditional node and link structure that you'd be familiar with from the web. And links are anchored on the text, and they kind of hint at what lies beneath. But hypertext authors play with your expectations and change the way that these systems behave. And the idea is that rather than beginning at the beginning and ending at the end, you continually interact with the text until you get some kind of closure. So Joyce makes the point that closure in any fiction is kind of a suspect quality, but here closure occurs when the story no longer progresses, or when it cycles, or when you tire of the past. At that point, the experience ends. So hypertext literature has actually been around for 3 decades. So there is a lot of work on understanding how it functions, and that work can be really useful to understand how narrative works within games. So in 1998, for example, Mark Bernstein, who runs Eastgate Systems, he did an analysis of the kind of structural patterns that were used by hypertext authors. He talked about cycles where the reader returns to previously visited items of the narrative and then eventually departs along a new path. Joyce's cycle, where you rejoin something you previously visited and then continue along a new directory after that. A contour, where you are constantly going around different cycles. Counterpoints, where you have 2 different voices or points of view that kind of alternate or interleaved. Tangles, where there is a real confusion of links and the reader is confounded and feels lost within the story. Or sieves, branching structures, where you get filtered through various layers of choices to different sections or episodes or outcomes. He talks about mirror worlds, where you have parallel versions of the text with slightly different changes or voices in those alternative worlds. And montages, where multiple writing spaces appear simultaneously and you look at them in juxtaposition with one another. Probably most usefully for games, Bernstein talks about split joins. So a split join is essentially the place where the reader makes a choice. The narrative briefly splits into, if you like, 2 alternative realities, depending what the reader has chosen. And then after that split, the narrative comes back together again. Splits permit the narrative to depend on the reader's choice for a limited span. And this is a really useful way of managing choice within our games. The Rashomon pattern, by the way, embeds split joins within a cycle. So you repeatedly revisit the same event, but you see alternative views of that event. And this the name comes from the film Rashomon, which is a story of a courtroom trial where the story is repeatedly told from different points of view, but with slightly different versions of the story depending on whose person you take, whose point of view you take. So many games use multiple split joins to create some kind of manageable story. So you have these kind of critical turning points. The player makes choices, goes away, explores some other part of the story, then comes back to another critical turning point. And the later you leave genuine branches, the more manageable your story is. So, for example, a game like Knights of the Old Republic, you're continually making these small choices about, are you walking on the light side or the dark part of the dark side? And at the end, you make a fundamental choice, which then either gives you a light side ending or a dark side ending. So in summary, we can see that narratives are kind of layered. We have fabula, the events and things that happen. We have the story on top of that, and we have the game text on top of that. We've seen that stories can be emergent, or they can be designed, and they can be linear, or they can be non-linear. And linear is easier, but of course has less agency. And we've also seen that digital games are not the first time that we get this kind of non-linearity. And stories with agency are known generally as ergodic literature. There's many non-game examples, and also work out there on looking at the sorts of structures that exist that we can draw on. And games tend toward these kind of split joins, which give players limited agency over sections of the story, but generally keep your story moving in an overall direction and make the thing manageable. Okay, so for the second part of this video, I want to talk about agency and how we manage agency within our games. So in the previous part, in part one, we talked a lot about choice, particularly in kind of non-linear stories. And choice is the manifestation of agency. It's where agency happens. It can be immediate, so the player's choice is made, and then immediately the story branches, and we have different realities according to what they've done. It can be deferred, so they make a choice, we remember that choice, and then later on there are consequences of that choice which send them down alternative paths. Or it could be cumulative, so over time the player makes lots of little choices that kind of has an impact later on. And that could be really simple. So in Mass Effect we have the idea of Paragon and Renegade points which accumulate over time, and then at certain choice points, depending on whether you have more Paragon or more Renegade, you'll get different outcomes of the story. One of the things about choice is that choices are not calculations. They are about overcoming internal conflict. That might be about making kind of risk value decisions, for example, or it might be about making moral or ethical judgments, or it might be choosing between two things which are unalike, but they are not calculations. Calculations have a correct answer. If you're thinking about which sword to equip in an RPG, there will probably be a best answer. One sword will be better than another, although that might hide behind complexity. So, in big RPGs or complex magic systems with sort of complex magic systems or magic weapons and those kind of things, it can be quite difficult to make a decision about which one thing is better than another, but it's still a calculation. In your games, try to give players genuine choices. So give them multiple goals which do not always align, so they have to prioritize and make decisions about those goals, and have choices that go beyond simple calculation. So for example, in BioShock, you have this kind of really well-known choice, which is, do you harvest or save the little sisters, these kind of genetically altered children that go around with these sort of big daddy machines that are extremely dangerous. Now, if you harvest them, they die, but you get 160 Adam. That's kind of the energy points that exist within the game. And saving you only gives you half as much, right? Now, if that was it, I think that would make it an interesting choice, because you can kind of take the moral high ground and you can save them, but you get less payoff for doing so. But the game itself has a little spin on it, which kind of spoils a little bit and turns it a little bit more into a calculation, in that there is a character in the game called Dr. Tenenbaum, and she will give you 200 Adam for every 3 children you save and some bonus goodies. And if you run the calculation through, what that basically means is that you are making a decision about whether you want sort of a small amount of Adam or whether you want some bonus goodies. So in that case, to a certain extent, it's still a choice because it's still an apples and oranges decision, but it's a much less interesting choice, I think, than it would have been had they not had those additional bonuses for saving them. And your decision will change the tone of the final cutscene of the game. So it's an example of how you can set yourself up to make an interesting choice, and then kind of back down a little bit and end up making something which is a bit more of a calculation. So another thing to consider is where does the interactivity happen in your story? Most of the time when we talk about interactive stories and non-linear stories, we're thinking about an interactive fabula. That means the player's choices actually change what happens, and it changes the outcome of the story. So, fighting fantasy books are a classic example of this, and lots of interactive fiction does this as well. But it's also possible to have an interactive story. So your choices don't change what happens, they just change how you experience the story. And actually a lot of hypertext literature is like that. For example, 253 is a really nice piece about a serious train accident with 253 passengers on board. And you can move around the train carriages, finding out about the passengers and finding out about their stories, but you can't change what happens. You're just changing your experience of this kind of tragic event. And of course, it's possible to have both those things together. There's nothing to say that you can't have choices which both change the way in which you experience the story and what happens. So one really interesting example of this would be a choice that happens early in Telltale games, The Walking Dead. You're trapped in a store with a number of different characters. The zombies are attacking, and the game presents you with a choice about, do you go to help Carly, who is a kind of a news reporter who has joined you, or do you go to help Doug, who is a kind of a geek who's joined your group, and you would like to save both of them, or you'd like to help both of them, but you can only choose one of them. So which one of them should you save? And depending on your choice, one or other of these two characters will die. So is this a choice or a calculation? Well, although many people will dress this up as a calculation and they'll try and make some sort of rational decision, I think it really comes down as a choice. You're making a decision between two different characters. It's not obvious that saving one of these characters will be beneficial to you from a kind of a mechanical point of view later on in the story. So you are making a moral choice about which one of these people should you save. Telltale have revealed that actually 3/4 of people choose to save Carly, and their suspicion is that's because the game by this point has actually shown you much more of Carly's character. She knows a secret about the main character, but has earned his trust by not revealing it. She joins the player on a sort of a difficult side mission. Doug, on the other hand, is quite a passive character. The interactions with him were actually taken out of the game for reasons of cost, so the players know him far less, and so the vast majority of people choose to save Carly. So was this changing the fabula or the story? Well, on first pass, it rather looks like it's changing the fabula. After all, depending on your choice, either Doug dies or Carly dies. But if you look at the structure for episode 1, you see this pattern. And essentially, what is this pattern? Well, it's a sequence of split joins. So you're making a sequence of decisions, and at the end of at that point, you get a different bit of the story, and then you come back again for the next point of the story. So you get this kind of direction. And at the bottom of here, you have this fundamental choice between Carly and Doug. But if we look at the next section of the story, what you actually see is that the story progresses in exactly the same way, depending on whether you've saved Doug or Carly, and then it comes back together at the end. How does it come back together at the end? Simple. They kill the other character. So if you save Doug, Carly dies. If you save Carly, Doug dies. Which means that going into chapter 4, the game can now assume that both of these characters are dead, and it can progress again as normal. And what's this pattern? This is a mirror world. This is one of the structures identified by Mark Bernstein. So the same structures happen, but essentially in one story, Doug is alive. In the other story, Carly is alive. So that's one way of kind of managing choice. And you will need ways of managing choice within your storytelling because of something called the narrative paradox. Because sometimes the story requires the protagonist to make some decisions. So, for example, in the story of Peter Rabbit, Peter Rabbit is warned not to go to Mr. McGregor's garden, but he goes anyway. And if he basically said, all right, Mum, that seems fair enough, you wouldn't have a story. You need him to do that. So the problem you have as a storyteller is if you give players full agency, they will sometimes make choices that ruin your story. So how do you deal with that? Well, there's a number of ways of doing it. So you can use patterns. So you can use the kind of Star Trek principle. So you at the end of every episode, you return the story universe to the same place. So episodes are interchangeable. You can use split joins, and we've just seen how The Walking Dead use split joins to kind of restrict the potential exponential growth of branching. And mirror worlds, again, we've just seen how The Walking Dead used mirror worlds to manage the narrative paradox. And of course, the value of mirror worlds is you use the same design and use the same assets and the same environments for both versions of the story. It's just that there are some minor differences in those versions depending on the choices that people have made. You can also use agnostic characters, a kind of a variation on mirror worlds, but the world differs just according to minor character differences rather than choices. This happens a lot in RPGs, where you can choose your character, but actually your choice of character has almost no impact on the story. Dragon Age Origins made a big deal about the fact that you have a different starting zone and a different initial story, but 4 or 5 hours into the game, you converge, and the rest of the game is kind of agnostic of your class and choices. Another example of this is the fact that Mass Effect contains straight, gay, and lesbian relationships. And many people have commended Mass Effect on being very progressive. But actually, it's also just a byproduct of being agnostic of the player's gender choice. So we allow the player to choose being male or female, and then we don't have to deal with that within the game because we allow every possible combination of male, 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 female, female, male, female, female, etc. And that's allowed within the game system. So the story is agnostic of that. We can use the illusion of choice. We can give players choices that look like they have that look like they have consequences, but actually don't do that. So Walking Dead has this interesting mechanism where it puts a prompt on the screen. It says things like, Ken will remember that, But very often there's no effect at all. But just by telling you there will be a future effect, they're kind of giving you the illusion that you have more choices than you have. You can also have choices where the exactly same outcome happens down both branches. So, you get to a room, there are 2 doors, and you can choose to go left or right, but actually whichever way you go, you'll find the important key that you needed to get for the story to continue. To a certain extent, what the player doesn't know won't bother them. And the illusion of choice is a perfectly reasonable way of managing this. You can use topology, use the physical space to restrict or encourage choices. So you might have triggered progression. You might use one-way systems. So, for example, lift shafts, zip wires, plane drops. Gravity is your friend. If people drop down and there's no way to climb back up, you are sort of forcing them to go in one direction, even though in theory they have an open choice about where to go. You can also use direction and misdirection, so you can use sort of psychological cues to push the player. You can highlight certain areas. If people enter a dark room and one corner is well lit with something in it, they will go to that corner. You can use visual and audio cues. You can give people easy and difficult paths. Even with open world games, if you actually put paths and roads in your game, players will use those paths and roads. And what that means is you can put interesting interactions and events on those paths and roads, knowing that they are more likely to be found than if you just scattered them randomly across the wilderness. You can also play with expectations. So, in a fantasy setting, people expect treasure to be in a chest. If you give them a chest, they'll open it, expecting to find treasure. So you know that they will take that action, or have a high likelihood to do, even though in theory they could decide not to. Another way of managing the paradox is just to limit the control the player has. So an infamous way of doing that is by using QuickTime events. So these are kind of on-screen prompts that just sort of limit your decisions, restricting the outcomes. So a prompt comes up saying, press X repeatedly, and you have to hammer the X key before you can progress on to the next scene. Or it might just pop up with press A or B to do different things. And another way of doing it is through cutscenes. In cutscenes, you take away their player's control completely and remove their agency completely. And that means if there's a really important decision that has to be made for your game to progress, you can put it in a cutscene. So instead of Peter's mother saying to Peter, don't go to the garden, and then saying to the player, do you want to go to the garden or not? You show a cutscene where Peter's mother says this, and Peter says, "Oh, I'm going to go to the garden anyway." Right? So the decision is taken out of the player's hands. Although you do have to be careful. So Metal Gear Solid 4, for example, has a final cut sequence which is essentially the length of a movie. So you have to make sure that you manage these carefully within your game. So in a sense, we have a number of different ways of managing agency, depending on whether we want to give people full agency, in which case we just have to restrict them by being careful what game mechanics we give them and what and using sort of open world topology. We can influence their actions through direction and misdirection. We can give them partial agency by using things like QuickTime events, by using patterns like split joins, or even using topology again. So having a door which only becomes unlocked after a certain point of the story, that we are forcing them to not progress until we are ready for them to progress. We can give them false agency, the illusion of choice, agnostic characters, and we can remove agency from them completely and make critical decisions something that happens, for example, in cutscenes. So in summary, we've seen that agency is the player's ability to make choices. We've seen that choices are not calculations and they can change the fabula of the story or both. And we've talked quite a lot about the narrative paradox, the tension between what the narrative needs and what the player can do. And we've looked at a number of mechanisms to manage this by using, for example, patterns, the illusion of choice, topology, etc. But this may still reduce agency. But this is okay. This is probably okay. As long as we are managing agency effectively, I think if we have points of false agency or points of no agency or partial agency, that's acceptable within the game environment, if it makes the overall experience work and the narrative and the game work together. Thank you very much for listening.